tonight's speaker did her undergraduate work at Cornell and got a master's degree in wildlife ecology from Humboldt State, where she's still affiliated, and then got a PhD in ecology from UC Davis. And she and her partner, Murat Gabriel, founded the Integral Ecology Research Center in 2004, and they've been doing some really interesting and important work. Recently they've had a rather high profile, perhaps higher than they really wanted, for exposing some of the harmful effects of trustless marijuana grows on our local wildlife. And her research combines laboratory and field methods to examine habitat use and disease concerns among native predators. It's an honor for me to introduce her. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Greta Wengert.
All right, thank you, Ken and Gretchen. And thank you all for being here. It started out a horrible, windy, rainy day. It's not so bad now. You can see a little bit of a few stars in the sky. Okay, so I'm going to talk about most of the research that has consumed me and a lot of my time over the past 10 years until, as Ken mentioned, this new topic came up. But this is sort of where my heart is and where I hope to continue doing research over the next several years. And so most of it has to do with what I started for my PhD work, but I continue to do it. So I'm going to talk tonight about give you a tale of 3 predators using conventional and progressive techniques to investigate forest-carnivore relationships. And with that, I want to acknowledge my co-authors, of which there are many, and there are actually more now that we're getting into different aspects of the project. Murat Gabriel, as Ken mentioned, is partner at Integral Ecology Research Center. Mark Higley at HOOPA Tribal Forestry. A few folks from the Forest Service down in the Sierras, Craig Thompson, Catherine Purcell, Rebecca Green, Deanna Clifford, who is the state veterinarian for the Wildlife Investigations Lab, and Rick Schweitzer from the SNAP project in the Sierras too. So I will introduce you to the cast in this tale. So I think our main character, as you probably gathered by now, is the fisher. And for those of you who don't know much about the fisher, it is a forest obligate carnivore. It is carnivorous, but it sometimes has omnivorous tendencies. And so sometimes we'll detect in their diet vegetation, berries, mushrooms, fungi. It is probably the reason that there's so much research on this species is because in 2004 it was listed as a candidate under the Endangered Species Act, and more recently last year, I guess in 2014, was proposed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And its fate is still being decided, and so we hope to have that decision later this year. Wow, my teeth did not know that. Okay, all right, so I just want you to get the full effect of the photos. All right, so the bobcat. It's a species that exists throughout North America. In most states, I think there's a couple states where it may not. It generally inhabits areas that are close to edge and with good cover, and because they are an ambush predator, they stalk their prey, and so they need good cover to find it. They are almost strictly carnivorous, legally hunted in California, but until August of 2015, they are no longer allowed to be trapped in California. The population status in the state is unknown for the most part, and that's part of the reason why there is this ban on trapping. Okay, and finally, the third member of the cast, the mountain lion. The habitat requirements are complex. They exist in mountains, deserts, but usually in places with good cover. They're almost strictly carnivorous as well. There is no legal take in California except for depredation permits. And there is debate over whether the population in California is increasing or decreasing. And there is a huge statewide effort from the Department of Wildlife right now to investigate that and try to figure out what the status of the population is in California. California fishers were historically thought to possibly be preyed upon by other carnivores. There are some accounts of coyotes killing fishers, great horned owls, and I think there's 1 or 2 accounts of mountain lions killing fishers. But for the most part, we didn't know if it was really a serious or a common occurrence. More recently, a study in HOOPA, which is just about 25 miles as the crow flies from here, a Native American reservation, there was a large study initiated in 2005 on fisher. And this is sort of prompted by the fact that it was listed as warranted under the ESA. And in the first couple of years of the project, they found that the fishers were dying at a rate more frequent than they had expected from predation, or what they thought was predation. So this sparked some concern. So with that, it prompted research into this mortality factor, and that's where most of this research stems from. So this is sort of where I came into the picture. I have worked with Mark Higley at the HOOPA tribe previously for a few years before that, and he had a big interest in what was going on, so we decided to start looking at this closer. So I worked with HOOPA, but I also reached out to some of the other fisher projects that were going on in the state. So 2 in the southern Sierra Nevada, and the California Fisher Translocation, which is in the northern Sierra Nevada, in Butte and Plymouth County, I believe. So all these projects had radio collar fishers. Oh, let me give you an idea of where we're talking about. So that star is HOOPA. Well, actually, it should be a little bit west of there. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's in Humboldt. Actually, it's where that black dot is. My stars came off. The 2 in the southern Sierra, and then the 1 up in Plymouth, Butte County. Okay, and so through these projects, we decided to, if we really want to investigate mortality, we've got to get to the animals quickly. So they're radio collared, which allows us to then get to the animals as soon as they die or shortly after they die. So we have a good chance to get an answer to the question. All the fisher carcasses went to UC Davis, VetMed Teaching Hospital, or California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab. These are 2 necropsy and diagnostic labs that do this type of work. And in most cases, predation could be confirmed by the pathologist. Okay, so this is sort of where the newer, more progressive techniques enter the picture. So we didn't necessarily care about how these animals are dying, but we are more interested at this point in what are the species responsible, or are they being killed by the coyotes and the great horned owls that have been suggested earlier in the literature. We wanted to find this out, and so we found a way to use the DNA from the predator saliva left on the carcass to be able to identify the species. And this had been done before in some situations where coyotes were preying on livestock, but it had never been used in a field wildlife on wildlife system. So to give you a brief background of the methods, essentially we're looking for bite wounds on the carcass, and you can barely see this one, but if you dig around the fur, you will eventually find bite wounds. Sometimes we measure them to sort of give an idea beforehand of what species it might be. But for the most part, it's that DNA that's really going to tell us the species without a doubt. We photograph and measure the bite wounds and some information, some diagnostic information about the bite wounds. Hopefully will help. I developed a protocol where I could send it out to the field biologists, so as soon as they get to these carcasses, they can start sampling those for DNA. And it has turned out to be a really effective method. So we're swabbing the bite wounds, teeth, even the claws. So presumably the fisher fights back, it gets predator DNA under its claws, and we actually can get predator DNA that way. Go back a second. Matted fur also sometimes is matted with saliva, and so we collect that as well. I'm not going to go into detail into the molecular methods, but essentially we use a process called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, where we take very small amounts of DNA. Remember, this is forensic DNA, so just like in the crime shows, and when they're swabbing the floor where a murder happened, or the CSI, the NCIS, we're essentially doing the same thing. we're taking a tiny amount of DNA, treating it through a process, and creating a huge amount of DNA that will then allow us to identify the species based on the sequence of that DNA. So I wanted to take a little bit of a tangent here. So this worked really well. And so since then, we wanted to see if it worked in other systems. And we have found that it's a very effective tool to identify predators in a lot of other important species. The Vancouver Island marmot is a critically endangered species that suffers from predation. It at times is the #1 cause of mortality. They're killed by mountain lions and actually martens in a couple cases. Black-tailed deer, we have found that in certain areas of the state, bears are responsible for a lot of deer deaths. It's not just mountain lions, but it's bears as well. Western pond turtles, it's worked on this. We have found that raccoons are preying on western pond turtles. And finally, another project that is sort of closer to home, marten predation. And this is sort of neat because I'm working with a few projects on marten in California and one in Minnesota. Most of the martens, anywhere you look, are being killed by bobcats. But in Minnesota, we found lynx predation as well as wolf predation. So some pretty neat answers. Now back to fishers. So here are the results we found. We did 102 fisher necropsies or found carcasses in the field. They aren't always available for necropsy because when they're predated, a lot of the carcass is missing. But we were able to identify predator species for 72 of those. So it's a pretty effective method. And since then, since this work came out, we've done a lot more and our success rate has gone up. So it's actually a pretty good way to identify. We found that 35 were killed by bobcat, 32 by mountain lion, 4 by coyote, and 1 by dog. And so this sort of tells us, okay, there are some coyote predation events out there, but clearly they're not the most important predator for fisher. And so this sort of changed everyone's thinking, and I think the bobcat result definitely surprised people. And what I didn't tell you is sort of the relative size of these two species. Male fishers can get up to maybe 6 kilograms, females up to maybe 3, 3.5. Bobcats in California are relatively small, and so they're not that much larger than fishers, and so I think that's what really surprised people. Okay, and then we went on to find out that 60% of female fishers were killed by bobcats, 34% by lions, and so, it's sort of a mixed bag for females. Okay, so now we know that bobcat predation is very significant for female fishers. Given that a lot of species dynamics are driven by female dynamics because a lot of carnivore species are limited by reproduction. Obviously, female, in a polygynous system where you only need a few males to many females to keep the population going. In a reproductive sense, females tend to be important. So we really wanted to look at this interaction of bobcats preying on female fishers. So our goal was to determine the habitat, well, let me back up a little bit. So now we have all this information about who is killing fishers, and what do we do with it? So a lot of fishers are getting killed by bobcats. Is it a natural thing? Is it something that's sort of been going on year after year after year in evolutionary time? Or is it something that we might be able to do something about because it is linked to something that is more recent and potentially human-caused? So those are the kinds of questions we wanted to try to get at. Our goal was to determine whether we could find out any habitat characteristics that might increase the risk of predation. So if we can do this, we might be able to actually have an effect on this process that may or may not be natural, but could be instrumental in the future of the fisher. So our goal with the project was to track bobcats in fisher habitat to try to describe what types of habitats bobcats are using. Before this, there's a lot of bobcat studies out there, but they're mostly in different habitat types completely. There's a lot in the southeast, there's some in the Midwest, there's a lot in Southern California, but these habitat types are the areas where fishers don't coexist with them. So this is sort of a novel question we're trying to address. track bobcats and fishers simultaneously, and this is where we had to reach out to other projects that were already tracking fishers. And finally, describe sites where bobcats killed fishers so that we could try to get an idea of risky habitats this way. Okay, so for this portion of the project, we chose 2 study areas, and one again in HOOPA, where a long-term fisher project had already been occurring, and the 2 in the southern Sierra Nevada. The HOOPA one is about, as I said, 25 miles inland in Humboldt County, not Trinity County, and the 2 in southern Sierra Nevada, which are, they're actually separate projects, but they're in the same general eco-region, and so I consider that sort of one area where I would try to capture bobcats and follow them. These represent the 2 isolated fisher populations in California, the big map on the left. So fishers used to exist for the most part throughout Northern California and down through the Sierras, although there is probably was a gap there for a very long time where they didn't exist. But they probably would have filled in most of that forested mountainous region. So to give you a little bit of an idea of our success, bobcats are not easy to capture. It took a very long time to get our first one with a collar on it. We started trapping in October, and through a huge, very patient effort by a huge field crew at HOOPA, February 5th, 2011, we caught our first bobcat, and it was very exciting. I think everyone that works in the wildlife group showed up to that capture. After that, it got a little easier, so we learned a little bit and got better at it. So we ended up with 8 at HOOPA and 8 in the Sierras, and we got usable data from about 13. Now, on these animals, we're using GPS collars, which is a lot, once you capture them and get the collar on them, it's a lot easier to get data. It basically collects data for you every 4 hours, and you have to go out every 3 or 4 weeks to download the data. It's a really fun process once you get the collars on the animals. So, moving on to sort of the more quantitative aspects of this research, we tried to do some modeling. And by modeling, we're talking about trying to have a sort of a depiction of reality when we don't know exactly what's going on all the time. So we get some locations from bobcats, and from those we try to model where bobcats spend their time most of the time. So 3 goals, we're trying to model habitat selection by bobcats and locations where fishers and bobcats overlap, and also these predation sites. So getting back to those goals of how we're trying to answer this question. Don't try to read this list, but I wanted to give you an idea of the many habitat variables that we incorporated into our model. To give you a little graphic, imagine all these variables that have to do with habitat. I mean, I'll read out a few: closed canopy forest, dense brush, open landslide, different types of forest management variables, forest, non-forest, edge, which is edge between 2 habitat types. We throw all of them into a model, and basically the program picks out those variables that are the most important, and you end up with a model of bobcat habitat selection. So this is essentially a graphic of what we had across the reservation. We had 4 male, good enough data for 4 male home ranges, which are the black polygons. These essentially represent everywhere that bobcat goes. And then 3 female home ranges. And so you can see the females are in red. There's a huge difference between the size of bobcat, female versus male home range. Okay, now we'll get a little bit into our results. So this is an index of habitat selection. It's a real simple process. We haven't yet gotten to the model. But essentially, anything on the right side of the 0 line is being selected for by bobcats. So you're more likely to see bobcats in that habitat type. Anything to the left of the 0 line, they're selecting against. And so, in short, You can see the tannish lines on the right side represent strong selection for a habitat type, and that happens to be open habitat. So we're talking about grass fields, cow pastures, those kinds of real open habitats. On the left of the zero line, you see there's a pretty good pattern of the same habitats being selected against. So that blue, the black, and the green represent the three on the bottom, which are three forested habitat types. Young closed canopy forest, young multi-storied forest, and older mature, otherwise known as old growth forest. So it seems that the bobcats, at least at HOOPA, were selecting against the forested habitat types and for the more open habitats. There isn't a lot of statistics you can do with this kind of analysis, but sort of just look at the frequency and who's choosing what. 5 of the bobcats showed strong selection for these open brushy habitats, and 6 selected against the forest types, except tan oak, which is sort of a different type of forest. It's a hardwood versus a coniferous forest. Okay, and so then we sort of looked at the home range scale. So what did each bobcat home range look like? We found that they selected, again, open, dense brush, and open shrubby habitats, and I just sort of wanted to give you an idea of what we're talking about. This is not HOOPA, but these are examples of what would be considered open shrubby on the bottom, open, and then dense brush habitats. So this is where you probably would see a bobcat. Again, I'm not going to get into the modeling. This is where the model comes into play. The important thing that you can see in our results at the top, the very top line shows the model that had the most support, which means made the most sense for reality. So habitat strata rows, which is sort of surprising for us, and edge habitat, so any line, linear feature between two different habitat types. Highlighted in green essentially is just showing what our results were, that brush habitats and open habitats, again, were very important for bobcats. And so again, I'll bring back to this idea that we're throwing all these variables into the funnel, and what's coming out on the other side, the green spheres that are coming out, is that roads, edge, and open brushy habitats are important, and we found that those that are not coming out as important, and in fact are being selected against, are the forested habitats. Okay, so now we have a pretty good idea of what bobcats like, and it's sort of neat because it can be depicted by the two photos on the left. But first I want to show you, this is a GIS representation of open habitats in tan, and then the green is that forested habitat. And all the green dots are locations of a single bobcat. And you could definitely see a pattern where they're sort of sticking to those open patches. On the left is, the top photo is one of our cats that hung out in meadows most of the time. And I love the picture on the bottom because maybe you do see it, but it's hard to see that there actually is a bobcat right there. And she's sitting right in between a cow pasture, some brush, and then that hard edge of the forest. All right, I won't go into too much detail with our Sierra data, but essentially we got really good data from about 5 bobcats represented by those circles. Those aren't home ranges, but I just wanted to sort of show you the distribution in relation to each other. So we had pretty good coverage, at least in that area. We found that the Sierra bobcats were sort of similar. They were choosing to inhabit hardwood forest, woodlands, and herbaceous areas. Okay. So now we wanted to move on to this idea of fisher-bobcat overlap, and it really allows us to get at this question of how are habitats potentially encouraging interaction between these two species, and how could we do something about it? Could we maybe manipulate habitats to decrease those habitat types? So here you see all the bobcat home ranges at HOOPA, and all the blue dots are fisher locations. So this is what we had to work with. We wanted to sort of look at where fishers and bobcats overlapped. What we did, in a nutshell, is we plotted all fisher and bobcat locations together. We chose fisher locations that were within 100 meters of a bobcat location, and we deemed these risky habitat locations. So these are areas where fishers had a higher chance of interacting with the bobcat. We buffered each with 120 meters, and this is because telemetry error tends to be a little higher than GPS error, at least in these GPS collars. And so we didn't know exactly within that 120 meter radius where the actual location was, so we buffered it and quantified the habitat features within those. And then we chose an equal number of non-risk locations, and so these were where fishers were located that were not near bobcats. And this is a graphic of sort of what I'm talking about. So basically, the blue dots are those fisher locations, the yellow dots are the bobcat locations, and so these would all be considered risky areas for fishers because they ended up very close to those bobcats. I wanted to show you this just because it gives you a good idea of what the bobcat habitat looks like at HOOPA. This is actually a cow pasture with some houses, and you can see they're pretty close to that edge. That's what I'm talking about. The hard edge is between forest and open. And then a lot of them are right close to roads and even on roads, and so we often see the bobcats walking right down the roads. This may be surprising, but bobcats and a lot of the larger predators use roads to get from one good foraging patch to another. And so if you're lucky enough to see them on a trail or a road, we were. And then we just overlaid with a GIS, and so these actually, you sort of pan back and forth. You may not notice the subtle differences in the habitat types, but when you pan it to the polygons that represent the different habitat types, you can see there's actually a lot of variation within those areas. So that's what we were looking for. Same modeling process, but now we're looking at these risk versus non-risk points. And what we found, green represents good for fisher. So we found that the older forest and the multi-storied younger forest was sort of protective of fishers. So the more they stayed in those habitat types, the less likely they were to interact with a bobcat. And then we found that the same variables that were important for bobcat habitat were also sort of risky for fishers. Now, it may not be as important to know that versus knowing what's important for female fishers, because as you remember, bobcats really are only preying on female fishers. So we ran the same process for females only and found somewhat similar results, but basically this young multi-storied forest was protective of fishers, whereas the hard edge and this new variable that was sort of interesting to us, this is basically regenerating forest closed canopy, so almost plantation-like, real young trees that are close together were risky for fishers as well, female fishers. For some reason, we did not see that the open habitats or the older forests were important in the model, and we're not totally sure why. But we think that the female fishers are just not that frequently going close to these open habitats. Okay, and then one last thing, we wanted to sort of look at the landscape scale. And so this photo right here, basically this is a bobcat core area, that red circle. The big yellow blob is a fisher home range. And so we wanted to look at where their home ranges overlap and sort of compare that and see what it looked like. So what we found, again, is that they did not overlap. The areas of the open were very underrepresented in the areas that they overlapped. And then likewise, there were roads and that young forest in areas where they didn't overlap. Okay, and so our final analysis, and I think this is one that is probably the most important because we started looking at actual locations where we knew that bobcats killed fishers. So this is sort of the ultimate and how you try to define this risky habitat. We don't have a lot of data, and that's why we wanted to look at the location data and how they overlapped. But this is important too, and so we only had, I believe we ended up with about 12 or 16 actual predation sites. And what we found is that predation sites by bobcat on fisher are generally more open to, or closer to open and brushy habitats than fishers where they're actually staying alive. Okay, so now it sort of seems that instead of, what's sort of interesting about this is that it seems like bobcats aren't necessarily going into fisher habitat and killing them. It's more that fishers are moving into risky bobcat areas, and that's where it's happening. Okay, so in conclusion, fishers are frequently killed by larger predators, bobcats and mountain lions. Bobcats in HOOPA, our study area in Northern California, are selecting open, dense, brushy, and shrubby habitats and selecting against forests. And that fishers are most at risk of predation by bobcats near roads, edges, and open habitats. And then, again, female fishers are even more at risk near drivable roads in this young, closed canopy forest. But there's actually a lot more going on up there. So you notice that character number 3 in this whole tale I haven't talked a lot about yet. And that's probably what a lot of people are excited about, the mountain lion. So we're continuing this research. So we know a little bit about bobcat-fisher interaction now. Now we want to know about lion-fisher interaction. So we know that in the Sierras, lion predation is really important. And what's interesting is only one study area out of all the ones we looked at was lion predation really important for females? And so we want to try to investigate that question. You know, why is it just there? Is the lion population a lot higher there? Is the habitat different? Are there fewer bobcats there? We're not sure. So we are collaring lions in the southern Sierras and trying to get at the same information. Another question that I have, and I think is really interesting, if you really think about the ramifications of it, is looking at higher order interactions among these 3 carnivores. And so by this, I'm talking about how are lions affecting bobcats. Maybe we know that lions probably prey on bobcats occasionally. They're a larger carnivore, they probably still compete. Are lions potentially affecting how bobcats use the landscape, which is then affecting how the risk to fishers? So that's the kind of question I want to look at. And if you think about it, it could almost be, and we don't know this because we want to really study it, that even though lions prey on fishers, their presence on the landscape could decrease the predation rate overall, if they're having an impact on bobcats. And so these are kinds of questions that are really interesting that also could be a management tool, just sort of knowing what species are out there that have an impact and knowing the multi-pronged relationship between all the predators out there. And so here is just a touch of data that we've gotten so far. It's going to be a long, time-consuming project to actually have all 3 species collared at the same time. Bobcats are, as always, the weak link. They're the hardest to capture, believe it or not. Mountain lions are not that hard to capture and get collars on. But we do have some data where the green dots are the lion locations, and it was a big female that came into a bobcat home range for a few weeks. And so these are the data that we're going to start looking at to see if there are patterns in where these species interact as well. And then finally, we want to investigate predation on fisher from the bobcat's perspective. So being that we know that fishers are probably more at risk when they start getting close to bobcat habitat, we'd like to know where in relation to the bobcat home range that they are killing the fishers. And it's sort of interesting because this bobcat, F03 at HOOPA, through genetics, we were able to determine that she was a killer of a fisher about 8 years before we collared her. And so it's sort of neat stuff that you can do with genetics. So we even though she didn't necessarily kill one while we had her on air, we knew that she had done it in the past. And so we could look at that location, where she killed the fisher in relation to her home range at this point in time. And with that, I want to acknowledge the huge list of folks that helped with trapping, lots of trap checks, day after day after day after day, as well as all the funding partners. And with that, I think I'm good. I'm on time, so I probably have time for questions. Thanks. Yeah.
Greta, have you done any work with predation with the martins? We hear a lot about recently.
Yeah, so I've worked with Keith Slauson and Bill Zielinski doing the Humboldt Martin project, Katie Moriarty, who's done a lot of martin work in the Lassen National Forest, and then actually some researchers in Minnesota. And so far, my aspect of the project has been on that forensic work where they're tracking the marten and get carcasses, and we take them to necropsy, and I investigate that. So far, we found that most of the martens that are dying from bobcat predation. That's true for the Humboldt martens and the Lassen martens, and actually it's true for the Minnesota martens as well. There are other predators in Minnesota that are having an impact too, but for the most part, it's bobcats.
Do you think it's possible that the difference between the all-fisher and female-only fisher risk models is just a function of sample size?
It's possible, but at HOOPA, the first several years of the project, they were only collaring female fishers, and so there's still tons of data for the female fishers. So let's say, they represent 2/3 of the data. So I think it's still a pretty good sample size. Mark and I have talked about it a bunch. We know for sure that I think the analysis is still going on, but we know for sure that the female fishers definitely are using different habitats and probably at different times than the male fishers are. And so they're at risk at different times in different places.
Do you have any idea why some of the female fishers are moving into the bobcat areas, like the open habitat and the brush, and therefore getting killed in those areas?
No, I don't, and I just want to make sure I didn't misspeak. They're not necessarily moving into the bobcat habitat, but they're moving closer to it. And that would take some more, a lot more teasing out to determine, is it right on the fringe of their home range that they're doing this? I think that's important. But what's interesting is that, I don't think we can really answer that question fully until we look at the mountain lion and male fisher question, because we know male fishers move so much more and probably move into risky habitat a lot more, but they're just not capable of being killed by bobcats. For the most, so far I think I've only had one young male fisher killed by a bobcat. That could be answered better with the mountain lion data.
Are you looking at the age of the fishers that are getting killed? Is it younger females that might be dispersing from our prone to this?
Well, we did look at that and we did not find a relationship with age. That is, well, I shouldn't say that completely. At HOOPA, we didn't find that. But sort of anecdotally speaking, when you look at the data from the Sierras, it does seem a lot of their juvenile animals are dying frequently, but I just haven't analyzed it yet. So that's a good point.
I know it's been really hard to get at, but what about their mutual prey species, like some of the smaller but large rodents that maybe they're both preying on? Is there some, it's interesting that they're probably both preying on some of those rodents, but yet that their habitat use is so different. So where are those other prey species spending their time?
Well, there has been some diet work done on those species. So we just, I have a whole freezer full of bobcat scats. I gave about 1/3 of them to Keith Slauson, who had some analyzed. And most, as far as the data suggests from HOOPA, there's a lot of rabbits in the diet of bobcats. Whereas there, the Fisher diet data, as far as I know, rabbits are absent or incredibly infrequent. However, I think a lot of the species that they have in common, that they're preying on, may be more edge species, so they could be sort of coming into that edge. I think wood rats are hugely important in both their diets, and to a certain extent squirrels. I think bobcats, the tree squirrels are less important in bobcat diet, but more important in the Fisher diet. So some overlap with some differences.
You may have already answered it, but is there what's the relation between the mountain lions preying specifically on the male fishers? Is there some does that like have to do with a behavior of the animal, or is there some?
We have no idea.
No, okay.
No, and that's so interesting because I mean, we totally understand why bobcats are preying on male fishers because it's just a size thing. But why are mountain lions focusing mostly on males? And even at HOOPA, we hardly see any female fishers being killed by mountain lions, but the males are. So, we've tossed the idea around that, it's just less bang for your buck for the females because they're half as large. But that, I don't know, it didn't sit well with me. I think it's probably a combination of habitat use and males taking bigger risks and happening to go in mountain lion habitat more, but we just don't know. Hopefully the Sierra work will tell us that. We are hoping actually to start a mountain lion project at HOOPA next winter as well, so maybe we can get at that. Yes.
Do we have a count on mountain lions in Humboldt County and is there any color?
No, I don't. I mean, I know there was a project here in Redwood National Park several years ago. There's some camera work on lions in Redwood National Park, but in trying to get this mountain lion project started in HOOPA, next year the state lion biologist came out to check out the study site, and he's the one who started running this statewide project to determine, to try to get an idea of statewide populations. He says the scarcest data he has is from this area. And so he was really excited that we're thinking about starting a project because, there just is very little information on mountain lions in this area. They're definitely here, and probably a lot of them, but we just don't know. Yes.
Do you have information on the status of the deer populations in the Southern Sierra versus HOOPA?
My guess is the Southern Sierra deer population is pretty healthy, and it's hard to say what the deer population up here is doing. I do know that at the time there was a study, a mountain lion deer study done in the Southern Sierras back, I think in the 80s, and the mountain lion population was huge. I mean, they easily caught something like 30 mountain lions in 2 seasons, and it's because it was so well supported by a really healthy deer population. But they think that's changed, and so the mountain lion population is sort of declined, and they think it's a result of a declining deer population. I'm just not sure what it's doing up here. A lot of people say there aren't that many deer at HOOPA, but when I put my cameras out, I've gotten way more deer than I ever thought I would on my cameras. So I think they're there, they're probably hiding better.
And you may have said this, but what was the length of time that you collected the carcasses, the 102 carcasses over?
That was, well, it's now up to like 160, but those data are from 2007 to 2012.
Yeah. Do you know how the Fisher population is doing in Minnesota? That seems kind of interesting to me how they would be doing there since they have very, very few mountain lions, if any, set up permanently living in Minnesota.
It's my understanding that in most other parts of the country, the Fisher populations are doing really well and recovering from a huge decline, from habitat management processes over the decades. And I think the same is true for Minnesota. I know the Northeast has a really healthy fisher population. I'm assuming that stretches into the Midwest. As far as I know, at least some of those Midwestern states have trapping seasons for fisher. It isn't until you get into the Rocky Mountain populations and, of course, the Pacific Coast populations that you see populations in peril.
Would it be an unfair assumption then to assume that the predation on fishers due to bobcats is because of land management?
I don't think it would be unfair. I think that could have something to do with it for sure. And our goal was to try to determine that. Through the process of listing the fisher, the agencies have to look at every possible facet of why they're in decline. Are they really in decline? Are they increasing gradually since the low that happened recently? And over this idea that, wow, bobcats are really having this huge impact on the fishers keeps coming up. But there's this question of, well, maybe the fishers can't sustain that level of predation, and maybe they always have. But then there's, the devil's advocate side saying, well, they probably haven't sustained this level of predation through the millennia because the landscape has changed so much, probably favoring bobcats in many situations. So there is, we'd love to be able to go back in time and do the same study, but we just sort of have to do these types of studies in different areas with different forest management practices and see what we find.
How much impact do you feel, if you're looking at the decline of the fishers, is timber management versus the marijuana industry? I mean, if you're going to ask that question about timber harvest or land management practices, marijuana growing is a land management practice also.
I 100% agree with you, and I'm immersed in it too much right now. Getting back to this task of the agencies having to deal with these kinds of things, that is one of the premier questions they're asking and trying to answer for the fisher. It's the first time the idea of illegal marijuana cultivation has ever come into play with any listing. But it is. It's like one of the factors being considered. So that's what they're trying to figure out right now. I have a whole other talk on marijuana and how it impacts the environment. But in short, I think everyone in this room would be surprised and disgusted about how many grow sites are out there and how they're all using horrible chemicals and fragmenting the land. And I'm talking the trespass grows on public lands. That's what I know about. So yeah, it could be a huge impact, but it's so hard to quantify that impact that
it's much easier to go after the timber companies because they're easier targets, I guess.
Exactly. No, totally. And it's funny because every time my husband Murad usually gives the marijuana talks. I mean, he told me today he counted 180 talks over the past 2 years that he's given on that topic. And that question always comes up, and it's always, well, why aren't you attacking the timber management folks, or why aren't you attacking the wine growers, and always sort of pointing fingers elsewhere. But I mean, I think everything sort of has an impact, and the whole trespass marijuana factor is just emerging, and we know so little about it. I mean, we're learning a lot over the past few years, but I think it's just sort of the extent of how many grows are out there is sort of new information that's sort of taking everyone by surprise. And the Fish and Wildlife Service is using that information to try to make its decision, but it's such a new emerging field that it's hard to really make a huge decision based on that. The other thing about fisher at this point is another reason that it's being considered is because of this huge risk of wildfire. And wildfires, especially over the past few years, tend to be happening in prime fisher habitat too. And so those are the two huge considerations that the service is thinking about and trying to make its decision based on that right now.
This is kind of a silly question, but I noticed that you're collecting these carcasses and that you have quite a collection.
Yes.
Do the bobcats, are they actually eating the fishers, or are you getting them before they can eat them? I mean, are they just play kills, or are they actually eating them for food?
Great question. So one chapter of my dissertation did look at that, and we found that, well, it's sort of either way. So often the bobcats, I would say more often than not, they will eat a portion of the carcass, so maybe half. The mountain lions will eat almost the entire thing and usually just leave like a jawbone or a tail from which we can get DNA. And the coyotes, even though there's only 4 events, kill it, bite it once, and leave it, and usually bury them, like dogs will do. And so, yeah, you definitely see patterns for that. It makes it difficult, sort of getting back to the marijuana thing, we're trying to assess whether exposure to these toxicants that the growers are using may predispose fishers to mortality factors that they otherwise may not be. So roadkill, being susceptible to predation, and it's making it really difficult to test the predated carcasses because most of it's gone, and you actually test the tissues for those toxicants. So looking at the interplay of the different mortality factors is interesting, but a little difficult too. Oh, think of,
So, in the wild, do fishers live by themselves? Are they solitary, or do they live with others?
they are for the most part solitary. The males are completely solitary. The females are solitary, but their kits will follow them around for several months after birth. And then the male kits will usually disperse, and the female kits, Michaela, you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but they tend to stick closer to their mom than the male kits will. Yeah.
Well, saying that, like, what are the, do you compare the ages of the carcasses that you have?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Do you compare the ages of the fisher carcasses that you have?
Age as in the animal age or how long it's
The animal age.
Okay. Yeah, so, well, we basically, a lot of the projects, HOOPA is the only project that takes a upper premolar at capture so that they can age it. They know the exact age of the animal. The other projects just sort of estimate by tooth wear. And so for every animal, we at least know whether it's a juvenile, a subadult, or a full adult fisher. And it, at least for the preliminary work that we did, it did not seem to matter the age of the fisher and whether it was killed by a bobcat.
And are the bobcats, are the mountain lions killing the bobcats?
We don't know. And that is definitely a question that, you know, the Sierra study and hopefully the HOOPA study, if it happens, we'll be able to get at that question. I had one bobcat die, or well, a couple died while they were on air, but one I knew died from predation. I'm pretty sure it was a coyote predation.
Did you have enough data to identify specific bobcats and to see if one had a frequency of whether it was learned behavior to target fishers, or were there just not enough data to tell that?
In certain instances, there were. So with genetics, again, you can do awesome things with genetics. The DNA that I got from the fisher carcasses sometimes was of high enough quality that we could identify the individual bobcat doing killing. And in 2 cases in the Sierras, we had one bobcat that killed 3 fishers, and another bobcat that killed 2 fishers. HOOPA, I don't think we saw any repeat predators, but it definitely does happen. It makes you wonder if it, I don't think they're singling them out, but for some reason, they're just more likely to come across the fisher in certain areas.
gonna break in there and thank our speaker once again.